a pair of hard-working doctors, and their eclectic brood of children.
The Santa Guidas are good, hardworking people.
Life is beautiful until some family members start flirting with disaster.
She was very, very sexual. She was into pornography. She was into trying to make pornography. It's not just like that good church-going family.
There are dark secrets hiding in this home, and some are more taboo than others.
Having someone strangled is bad enough. But that turned this into a really, really dark case.
Evergreen, Colorado. An alpine enclave perched just above the bustling Denver metropolis.
Evergreen is a beautiful mountain community. People love the open air atmosphere, the outdoor activities, and the natural beauty.
You'll find all types in this tolerant town. Even sick and twisted killers. Around here, the sunny Santa Guida family fits right in. Kids Zach, Becca, and Libby are all adopted, yet they're siblings in every sense of the word. Each Saturday, the trio treks to their local farm share. Here at the co-op's produce stand, you'll often find 18-year-old Zach by himself, carefully selecting provisions for the week ahead.
All the Santa Guida children had different personalities, and Zach would be the most introverted.
This lumbering loner would much rather stir a stew than fling a football. His passion is food.
Zach is a big guy, over 6 feet, really quiet, but he was always very nice, always loved hugs.
He was just unassuming. He didn't bother anybody. He was kind of like that gentle giant.
While Zach does the shopping, his sisters Becca and Libby have other interests on the farm. Becca, the youngest Santa Guida, is a tender-hearted girl.
She had an old soul. She loved poetry, she loved literature, but she was also outgoing.
It's no wonder she takes such joy in the company of animals. This 16-year-old is gentle as a lamb.
I seen compassion in her. I felt more compassion from her than anybody else in the family.
If there's one thing Becca adores more than baby animals, it's her big sister, 24-year-old Libby.
She loved her sister and looked up to her, and I think she probably wanted to be more like Libby.
Libby loves Becca too, but sometimes she could use a little space. Free-spirited Libby Santa Guida dances to the beat of her own drum.
Libby, she loved art, she was loving to all kinds of people, and she was just friendly.
This bohemian beauty is very alluring. But seductive girls can attract dangerous suitors. Libby's farmhand boyfriend, Gregory, is not your typical Romeo.
She came right out and said, I'm attracted to bad boys.
In many ways, Libby's boyfriends were a mirror of her. Guys that are a little bit out there with the tattoos and the piercings. Not necessarily the type of guy you'd see running around Evergreen.
Libby never wants to settle for the mundane. But Gregory will soon stir up more excitement than she bargained for. Back at the Santa Guida house, Mother Helen is brimming with joy. It's Becca's birthday, and Mom has a gift she just knows her daughter will adore.
Helen is a physician at the local hospital there in Evergreen, Colorado.
She was the backbone of the family. She held everything together.
This nurturing matriarch lives her life like an open book.
What's that?
Even when that means spoiling a surprise.
She is the type of woman that you'd want as your wife, as your mother, a credit to the Evergreen community.
Helen may be a career woman, but family always comes first. On the other hand, Helen's husband, Rick, isn't home much. He likes to hang out in his lab.
Dr. Rick Santaguida is a very well-known physician in the Evergreen, Colorado area. He's well-liked by most folks there.
Dr. Rick's interests range from hypertension to hydroponics. A homegrown medicine man who dreams of concocting the next miracle cure.
Rick was known as a free spirit in the neighborhood. A good guy, but a little different.
Rick was a loving parent from all accounts, but not there a lot, not supervising a lot, and certainly not ruling with an iron fist.
Rick's sure alternative medicine is the future. But this doctor will soon see the very life choked out of his own loving family. Dr. Rick swears by one age-old remedy for whatever's ailing you.
Rick leaves his successful family practice to become a pot doc, screening people for medical marijuana.
Elder daughter Libby has shown a budding interest in Dad's business and works as Rick's office manager.
She was attractive and maybe increased business a little.
She was a very, very sexual person. She was not afraid to show skin.
She is a drawing point for more business.
Clients start lining up. And before long, Dr. Rick's business is really smoking. The Santaguida's lives seem just splendid. And younger daughter Becca's 17th birthday is the perfect occasion to enjoy some good, wholesome family time. Becca's brother Zach has baked a scrumptious cake for what should be a day of fun. But Libby has gone and invited a guest, unbeknownst to her parents.
No matter how progressive or liberal they were, I don't think they really wanted a bad boy in the house.
I think in many ways it was just a way for her to tell her dad, this is my life and I'll live it the way that I want to.
Father Rick lets a lot slide, but he can't stand seeing Gregory's paws all over his elder daughter. And with tensions running high, the littlest thing is enough to send the family over the edge. Dad has finally had enough.
Wipe that grin off your face. Get out of here.
If Libby knows what's good for her, she'll ditch the bad boy.
Get out of here.
Siblings Zach and Becca feel caught in the middle.
Dr. Rick and Helen wanted Libby at that point to get rid of him.
What started as such a happy occasion is now mired in disappointment. But a fingerful of icing is the least of this family's problems. In a few short weeks, Father Rick, Mother Helen, and kids Libby, Zach, and Becca will see their patchwork family torn to pieces. Coming up, Becca starts to emulate her big sister as scandalous liaisons lead the Santaguidas down a path to murder. From the outside, the Santaguida residence still appears every bit as peaceful as the charming homes to its left and right. But for the Santaguida family, serious trouble is on the horizon.
Rick and Helen, they are good, hardworking people, and I commend them for adopting kids. But Rick wasn't around a lot. The kids are kind of left to their own devices.
Though Rick wants Gregory to get lost, he still swaggers around the Santaguida home like he owns the place. Rick and Helen can't stand him.
Both parents think Gregory is using Libby just to have a good time. Rick feels like he's using Libby for sex. He's using her, period.
The elder Santaguida sister doesn't care what the family thinks of her boy toy. Gregory scratches an itch, and that's all that matters to lusty Libby Santaguida.
Libby was what you call risque. Her behavior, her mannerisms. I mean, she was out there.
She was into pornography. She was into trying to make pornography.
She was very open about having sex toys and about wild behavior. And she liked letting people know about it.
Even her little sis, Becca. Becca wants to be just like her big sister.
You have Libby, who's a little bit older, and then Becca. And like a lot of sisters, Becca and Libby, you had a little bit of the mentoring going on. You have the pretty older sister who's outgoing. Everybody wants to be around her. And Becca actually, in many ways, wants to be like her.
No matter how open-minded you are as a parent, even if you're a doctor like Rick who prescribed marijuana, you have to have some concern when your daughter is talking about pornography and sex toys and wild behavior. Especially when she has a younger sister looking up to her.
It's easy to see how Libby's tutelage could bewitch little Becca. But who'd guess this sister act would soon be upstaged by blood? In the midst of all this carnal chaos, one family member is on his own.
Libby, she was the queen bee. You know, she was the one we went to hang out with and talk to and get advice.
Zach gets jealous at the fact that Becca and Libby kind of go around him to show each other how much they care about each other.
Meantime, middle sibling Zach is the odd man out. His parents can't help but fret over this lonely high school senior's lack of social life.
Zach's not a great student at Evergreen High School. He senses that. He likes to be by himself.
Zach, I got a letter from your school.
Zach wasn't one of the jocks. He wasn't on any of the sports teams, no student council. He was definitely not one of the overachievers.
Not very good at school. The other kids there, they make fun of me.
Luckily, his mother, Helen, has just the prescription for Zach's reclusiveness.
His mother had given him medication for depression, anxiety, and ADHD. His medication is dispersed by her and only her.
Dr. Helen's prescription does inspire Zach to take action. Just not the kind she'd hoped for. One semester from graduation, he drops out of high school to pursue his dream of becoming a chef. There's nothing his family can do about it. With the Santa Guidas in crisis, Helen insists they all spend some time together. But this disintegrating family is in no mood to sing Kumbaya.
I would say Helen, she was just overwhelmed. She bit off more than she could chew.
Sexpot Libby is in love with a delinquent. Becca is enamored with her sexy sister. Zach is an antisocial dropout. And Rick is preoccupied with his pop business. In a few short hours, the whole flailing family will go up in flames. The following evening, as melting snow transforms Evergreen's trickling brooks into raging rapids, Dr. Rick heads to the office. But his daughter Libby is nowhere to be found.
When Libby did not show up, as she promised Dad, Dr. Rick picks up the phone, tries to get a hold of her.
But he gets no answer. Nor is there any answer from Libby's boyfriend, Gregory. In fact, Rick doesn't hear from anyone until 10:45 p.m., when Becca calls.
Becca?
Rebecca couldn't find Libby, so she calls her dad, wants to know if she's with him.
Becca thought that Libby was with Dad, and Dad thought that Libby was with Becca, so it became one of those, I thought she was with you, no, I thought she was with you.
With her mom asleep, Becca searches the house at her dad's request. Rick hears next is a piercing scream.
Becca starts calling to her, Libby, Libby, and says, Dad, I think she's dead.
Coming up,
Jefferson County 911. My sister, we just found her. We need help. Her face is purple. Her heart is barely beating. I don't know what's wrong.
the Santa Guida home is in chaos after eldest sibling Libby is found unconscious.
Libby!
Mother Helen administers CPR. Sister Becca is on the phone with emergency dispatch. And brother Zach is paralyzed with fear.
Every time you mess with your emergency.
My sister, she's on the floor. Her face is purple and she's not waking up.
Is she breathing?
My mom says she thinks she can hear a heartbeat. We're trying to wake her, but she won't wake up. Oh my God.
Okay, stay with me. They're on their way.
1/2 mile to the residence, we got updated by dispatch that victim was now not breathing and not conscious. We went into the residence and we found a female laying on her back. Her eyes were slightly open and not breathing. She did not have a pulse, and her skin was cold to the touch and stiff.
Libby Santa Guida is pronounced dead at the scene. Paramedics and deputies assume it had to be a tragic accident.
There's a good possibility that she could have fallen and possibly hit her head or just knocked herself out.
But a closer examination of Libby's neck reveals some troubling signs.
She has the ligature marks. There's scratches there as well. So they immediately could rule out her falling.
That is when it goes from a medical situation to a criminal situation.
With Libby's bedroom declared a murder scene, homicide detectives struggle to piece together the clues.
They make note that this entire place is in disarray.
While they were checking the body over, a technician finds that there is petechiae. It's the pressure that ruptures the blood vessels in the head and in the eye area when there is a strangulation, which there again leads to the ligature.
And strangulation was just part of it.
Her clothes were not in place on her body, and her pants were unhooked. It leads them to believe that she was sexually battered. Her blouse was up above her abdomen, and they were able to see that she had some sort of fluid on her body, and they suspected that it was seminal fluid. Then they have to take sterile strips and collect fluid so that it can be tested for DNA.
Having a young woman strangled is bad enough, but that turned this into a really, really dark case.
Investigators can't know for sure if Libby was attacked 5 minutes ago or 5 hours ago, or if the fluid was left by the killer, or someone else Libby slept with prior to her murder. While the sample goes off for testing, investigators go digging for answers. First question: could an attacker have slipped into the Santa Guida house unnoticed. Zach says he often saw Libby's boyfriend, Gregory, coming and going from her bedroom.
Zach said the door is always left unsecured. It's never locked. He said anyone could have walked in and done anything.
When detectives hear about this boyfriend, this bad guy, Gregory, it's naturally going to raise suspicion because in a murder, you look at boyfriends. It could have been some wild sex affair that went wrong.
As a team of detectives is dispatched to find Gregory, Santa Guida Patriarch Dr. Rick finally arrives home, and he's fuming.
Dr. Rick demands to the deputy that he see his daughter.
He wasn't crying, he wasn't depressed. Instead, he says, I want to see the body.
Anybody that knows about homicide scenes knows there can be no one other than the investigators in that scene. So he was not a happy man.
And he unleashes on wife Helen for letting Becca call 911.
That raised the red flag immediately. Why would he deny his family to call 911?
It's unusual in a murder investigation for a dad to berate his wife for calling the police.
This is shaping up to be quite the whodunit.
There's a dead girl and 4 family members in the house, and they have a boyfriend who's suspicious. In a case like this, everyone's a suspect.
Her father, Rick, mother, Helen, and younger siblings, Zach and Becca, are all detained for questioning.
All family members are interviewed concurrently in an effort to smoke out the killer.
Helen gets interrogation room 1.
She said, I have been at work all day. I left at 6 this morning. I didn't get home till 8 tonight.
Helen claims she sifted through the mail as Becca prepared for a movie date with Libby.
Helen gets back to Evergreen late in the day to have dinner, tie up a few different things errand-wise within the home.
According to Helen, she was delighted to find a dinner prepared by her son, Zach.
She has dinner with her daughter, goes upstairs. Not much to talk about.
Before turning in, Helen checked on her son and found him sleeping peacefully in his bedroom. The protective mother is certain that neither of her children were involved in the murder.
But maybe mom is trying to cover up by saying no one was really around Libby at the time that she died.
In interrogation room 2, little brother Zach Santaguida is on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
When a detective interviews someone that has social anxiety, they have to be very careful. If he feels pressured in any way, he could go off and refuse to talk to them.
Zach says he spent all day plodding around the house and made a salad for his mother's dinner in the evening.
He said he doesn't drink, he doesn't take drugs. All he does is sleep and make food, basically.
Zach says, I'm never around the rest of the family. I don't really care about much in life. Why would I care about killing my sister?
Could this thoughtful, timid young man really be a killer? He hardly seems the murderous type. But to eliminate all doubt, detectives ask Zach if he's willing to volunteer a little DNA.
The detectives asked him, would he mind giving a DNA sample? And he asked, well, how would they take the DNA sample? The detective told him it would be a swab, and he goes, oh, yes, you would swab my mouth, correct? And he said, yes. He didn't have a problem with giving the DNA sample at all. He said, that'll be fine. So he did a buccal swab, which is swab each side of the mouth.
Just down the hall in interrogation room 3, Zach's sister Becca insists her day was uneventful.
She had gone to school, gotten home early afternoon. She had planned with Libby the night before to watch a crime show with her, and that was their movie night.
Becca says she looked forward to her big sister Libby arriving home and swiped some of her mom's dinner while she waited.
Becca is puttering around the house, waiting for her sister to watch their crime drama.
She kept waiting, and Libby never came home from work.
When Becca found Libby's body, she just knew it was a murder from the start.
The detective said, why do you think that it's a murder? Because I saw a ligature mark on my sister's neck. And you know what a ligature mark is? She said, yes, I watch all the crime shows.
So it's something she probably heard about in a plot. But this was real life.
Finally, little sister whispers that detectives should look into a bottle of alcohol that went missing from Libby's bedroom a week before the murder.
She's always taken inventory of the family. In many ways, for a murder mystery, was the perfect storyteller.
Across the hall in interrogation room 4, Rick swears he and Libby got along great.
Dr. Rick said he had a better relationship and more open relationship with Libby than his wife Helen did.
Investigators ask why Rick panicked over policemen in his home. He has a simple explanation.
He's, in essence, trying to cover up a little bit for marijuana in his house, not trying to cover up for murder.
Dr. Rick is an evaluator for medical marijuana. So when the investigators asked permission to go through their house and check for things, that raised a flag with him and said that he wasn't real sure that he wanted them to do that.
Rick is a little nervous, understandably so. He's a little worried about authorities finding some of his product in his home. So he is a little upset with authorities, even as he's giving his statement about the night that his daughter died. They're wondering if maybe because the marijuana industry somehow brought perhaps a murderer to his doorstep.
Dr. Rick actually told detectives that he had a license to have medical marijuana.
But surprise, surprise, the pot doc's license seems to have gone missing.
He could not present that license, so that would have raised a red flag as well to the detectives.
Is Rick's medical marijuana venture really as by the book as he claims? Might employee Libby have discovered some damning secrets about Dad's business?
When police talked to Dr. Rick, they found out he had a meeting with the medical examiners that day.
He had to meet with some of the commissioners because he had had some complaints from patients that were definitely not in his favor. He said, well, the commissioners just wanted to find out if I was nuts.
Rick claims to have been at the office all night. But could he have slipped out for a quick trip home?
They asked Dr. Rick for a DNA sample, and he refuses.
Why wouldn't you want to give a DNA sample to exclude yourself from hurting your daughter?
But Rick insists detectives should be focusing on Libby's lover.
He said that Libby did not have a great talent for picking good guys. And then he mentioned this guy she was dating, Gregory.
With the clock ticking, a team of detectives is already hunting Gregory. But the boyfriend isn't the only one investigators are looking into. Did Father Rick kill to cover up some shady business? Does Mother Helen know more than she's letting on? Did panicky brother Zach go on the attack? Did Sister Becca's infatuation go too far? Or is boyfriend Gregory every bit as dangerous as the family feared? Coming up, the answer to this killer riddle is more shocking and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. In Evergreen, Colorado, homicide detectives are on the hunt for Libby Santaguida's killer. And more than anything, they need to find the victim's unsavory boyfriend, Gregory.
When investigators finally tracked down this Gregory character, he had a great alibi. He had been in jail.
Arrested for petty theft.
It turns out he's been in jail since before the crime occurred. And so there was a roadblock at that point because they thought maybe they had their man, but their man was already behind bars.
Of course, Gregory would have good reason to leave his DNA behind. But lo and behold, it's not his. With boyfriend Gregory in the clear, investigators wonder whether the best place to look for answers is within the Santaguida family. Maybe there's something more to Becca's story about Libby's stolen liquor.
Investigators now are starting to hone in a little bit more about this bottle of alcohol.
It's unlikely parents Helen or Rick would swipe Libby's booze. And Becca would keep quiet were she the culprit. But what about Libby's underage brother, Zach?
Zach has said all along that he's kind of aloof and a loner, but he's no boozer.
Was Zach lying about drinking? And if so, could he be lying about murder too? Detectives sit Zach down for one last round of questioning.
They asked him, we understood earlier that you said that you didn't drink.
This is where Zach starts to still claim his innocence, but, well, maybe I have a drink here and there.
For investigators, Zach's small deception is a big red flag.
If he could semi-fib about one thing, maybe they should ask him about the other. Zach starts to break down a little bit when it comes to the fact that he does sometimes go into Libby's room.
You have Zach, who's shut in, has no friends, and is pretty weird. And he is now infiltrating his sister's space. She was sexual and outgoing.
Now the authorities are sensing maybe there was something else there between brother and sister that they hadn't sensed before.
A sick, twisted motive begins to take shape. Did Zach have sex with his adopted sister Libby? If so, could he have killed to keep her quiet?
Detectives asked Zachary if he ever fantasized about his sister or desired her. And he, of course, denies it all.
Investigators remind Zach they've already taken his DNA. If he's guilty, it's only a matter of time before they match his sample to the semen from Libby's abdomen.
Because it's hard to argue with technology.
Backed against the wall, the sleeping giant finally admits to the unthinkable. He strangled his sister.
Little lies do lead to big lies, and this just shows it. He told several little lies that came back to the great big one. When Zach finally did say he killed her, they let him fill in the blanks.
The freakish chain of events began earlier that evening when Zach snuck into Libby's bedroom.
He admits going down to take some DVDs. He didn't know Libby was there. Libby catches him.
Zach, give me the DVD.
Libby yells at him to put the DVDs down. She tells him to drop them. He drops them because it startled him.
You're such an idiot. You're a loser. I'm tired of this.
And that's where he snaps.
She bends over to pick the DVDs up, and he smacks her really hard just below her shoulder blades.
In a shocking fit of rage, Zach sets upon his sister.
After she falls to the floor, he starts choking her. He says he's not sure why, but he was just angry.
He said that he found a shoestring. He took it and used it as a ligature and pulled it taut around her neck. Detectives asked him, was she dead? And he said, yes, she was dead.
But Zach's not done yet.
Now we have a murder. Brother on sister. But it even gets more strange. He does the unthinkable. He unzips her pants and sexually assaults her.
When he finished telling the detectives exactly what he did to Libby's body, he told them he went upstairs and went to sleep.
Zach Santaguida is arrested and pleads guilty to his sister's murder. His perverted confession scandalizing the entire town of Evergreen.
Why don't you tell me what you know what happened to her?
I killed her. I regret it, but I did.
I think the most shocking thing was the sexual assault. That I think was really hard for everyone to wrap their head around. I think it still devastates a lot of the kids that know Zach and Libby to this day. It's a black mark on Evergreen.
To me again, how you hit her?
Just kind of on the upper back.
Zach is going to be behind bars more than 70 years for the conviction. Gruesome crimes happen in the best of communities. If it can happen in Evergreen, it can happen anywhere.
Today, sleepy little Evergreen is peaceful.
By the time the city began to understand that something was wrong, Austin was already living inside the shadow of it. At first, the fear did not arrive all at once, not as a thunderclap, not as a mob running through the streets with lanterns held high, but as a slow change in the air. The kind that settles over a place before anyone can give it a proper name. The night seemed to grow heavier. Windows were checked twice. Doors that had once been pulled shut with a careless hand were barred with deliberate force. People lowered their voices when they spoke about women walking home after dark. The city was still young enough to imagine itself becoming something polished and permanent, a place of lawmakers, merchants, churches, porches, wagons, and ambition. But underneath that ambition lay the rough grain of a frontier town, and under that roughness lay old hierarchies, old cruelties, and a silence that made some lives easier to overlook than others. In daylight, Austin could pretend to be orderly. In darkness, it became a map of blind corners, empty yards, narrow alleys, and wooden houses that creaked like living things under the pressure of the wind. The city slept unevenly, and in that uneven sleep, women began to bleed. This is where the story begins, not with a single scream, not with the first blow, but with the shape of a city preparing itself for progress, while carrying inside it the habits of indifference. In the 1880s, Austin was changing quickly, though change in such places never fell evenly. Some streets hinted at prosperity. Brick buildings rose where only rougher structures had stood before. Men spoke of growth, rail lines, business, civic pride, and the future of Texas. Public life belonged loudly to white men who stood in offices, on courthouse steps, and in newspaper columns, declaring what the city was and what it would become. But the labor that kept daily life functioning often moved where those public declarations did not look. It moved through kitchens before sunrise, through backyards where wash water steamed in tubs, through bedrooms where floors were swept, curtains shaken, children dressed, and meals prepared. It moved in the footsteps of servant women whose work began before most of the city opened its eyes and ended long after lamps were lit. Many of these women were black. Some had been born into slavery and were living through the uneasy, unfinished aftermath of emancipation. Others had been born just after the war and inherited not freedom in any generous sense, but a harsher bargain. They were free enough to work, free enough to be underpaid, free enough to be blamed, and free enough to be forgotten. They lived in modest dwellings, boarding arrangements, rented rooms, or small servant quarters behind the homes of those who employed them. They washed, cooked, scrubbed, hauled, soothed, mended, and endured. Their hands made order for households that would not have known how to keep themselves without them. Yet when public memory later began arranging the dead into something like a story, these women were often pushed to the edges of it, their names flattened, their suffering treated as a grim prologue to a panic that became more interesting to the city only when fear crossed certain racial and class boundaries. But before the newspapers sharpened their headlines, and before the city gave the violence any larger mythology, there were simply women trying to survive in a hard place that asked much from them and protected them very little. Austin at night in those years was not the glowing capital a later century might imagine. Darkness was real darkness. Lamps offered pockets of vision rather than certainty. A yard could vanish 3 steps beyond a doorway. A figure could pass under a tree and become part of the trunk, part of the fence line, part of the block seen between houses. Sounds carried differently after midnight. A dog barking too long could rouse a household. A loose shutter could beat the side of a house like a frantic hand. The crunch of boots on packed dirt might mean a neighbor returning late, a laborer heading home, a drunk, a patrolman, or something far worse. Women who worked in service often moved through that darkness because labor demanded it. They rose early, traveled in dimness, returned late, or slept in structures separated from the families they served. Their lives were visible in use and invisible in danger. This mattered. It mattered because a predator, whoever he was, does not hunt in abstraction. He studies the habits of a place. He learns who can be reached, who is isolated, who will be mourned loudly, who will be mourned quietly, and who might be written off as one more tragedy in a world already arranged to expect suffering from certain people. Long before investigators would fumble through theories and the public would reach for names dramatic enough to contain its fear, the city itself had already created the conditions that made such violence possible. That is the first truth of this case. A killer may wield the weapon, but a society makes choices about whose vulnerability remains exposed. In the Austin of the 1880s, race and class were not background details. They were the architecture of risk. To understand the terror that followed, one must first understand the ordinary life that came before it, because ordinary life is where danger hid best. Morning began with ash and water. Women bent over stoves while the sky was still pale and uncertain. They fed fires, kneaded dough, boiled coffee, and carried wood with arms already sore from the previous day. Some worked in homes grand enough to have separate spaces designed to keep labor out of sight. Some worked for families that were merely trying to imitate gentility, clinging to status through appearances that depended on cheap help. The work was repetitive, intimate, and exhausting. A servant woman might know the moods of a household better than its own patriarch did. She could tell from a footstep on the hall whether the mistress was anxious, from the scrape of a chair whether breakfast would be rushed, from the cry of a child whether a whole day's order would collapse into noise and demands. Yet this knowledge, so complete and bodily, brought no safety with it. It only meant that she was trusted to do the labor no one wished to name while remaining socially exposed in nearly every other way. Pay was meager. Privacy was fragile. Reputation could be damaged by rumor alone. Complaint was dangerous. And still, women built lives within those constraints. They courted, laughed, saved coins, cared for siblings, dreamed of better situations, attended church, stitched dresses from worn cloth, and held onto dignity in the small, fierce ways the poor have always done. It is easy, looking backward, to let history turn them into symbols before allowing them to be human. But the women who would become part of this story were not born as victims in waiting. They were women with routines, preferences, grievances, habits, jokes, fatigue, memories, and private hopes. One may have hummed while sweeping. Another may have preferred the cool of early dawn before the household woke. Another may have hidden a little money in a hem. Another may have worried constantly about a mother, a child, or a brother. To enter this case honestly, we must resist the laziness of seeing them only at the moment of attack. They lived whole lives before the violence reached them. That is precisely why the violence feels so terrible when it comes into view. It did not descend upon faceless figures. It fell upon women already carrying the weight of the world on tired shoulders. Fear, when it began to spread, did not do so evenly either. In some neighborhoods, whispers moved quickly. In others, concern took on that ugly quality of selective attention, the kind that asks first who was harmed before deciding how much alarm the harm deserves. The earliest victims did not all receive the same kind of public mourning. Their race and their station affected how their stories were told, how urgently their deaths were framed, and whether they were treated as individuals or examples. A white woman attacked in the night threatened the social imagination differently than a black servant woman murdered behind the house where she worked, though both bled the same in the dirt. Both were struck by the same human force, and both left behind the same stunned silence in the rooms that knew them. This is one of the cruelest currents running through the case. The city was horrified, yes, but not always equally. Panic has its own prejudice. It can begin in indifference, deepen through spectacle, and only afterward claim moral clarity. Newspapers help shape that reaction. The press in a city learning its appetite for sensation could turn violence into public theater with disturbing speed. A headline might sell dread while erasing the full humanity of the dead. Descriptions could be breathless, lurid, moralizing, or dismissive, depending on who the victim was and what story the paper wished to tell about the city and itself. This, too, forms part of the atmosphere of the case. The murders were not only acts of physical destruction. They were also events filtered through a social machinery that ranked grief. One woman's death could be reduced to a grim item. Another's could become a civic crisis. Yet beneath the uneven language and the distortions of public telling, something unmistakable was unfolding. Women were being hunted in their beds, in their rooms, in the spaces where exhaustion should have granted them the small mercy of sleep. There is something especially violating about that fact. The day already took so much from them. Night was meant to return at least a little safety. Instead, it became the hour in which the city seemed to betray them completely. Imagine the feel of those houses then. The thin walls, the warm stale air, the rattle of a frame in the wind, the mattress ticking, the wash basin catching a small square of lamplight. The work clothes hung nearby for the morning, the ache in the back after a day bent over labor, the body giving in to sleep because it has no choice. Then imagine the sudden interruption of that ordinary surrender, a sound, a pressure, a shape where no shape should be. The violence associated with the servant girl annihilator killings would come to be remembered for its brutality. But brutality alone does not explain why the case lodged itself so deeply into the imagination of the city and later into American criminal history. What made it unforgettable was the collision between modern urban anxiety and older social cruelties. Austin wanted to see itself as advancing, civilized, governed. Serial violence suggested the opposite. It suggested that beneath official order lay helplessness. It suggested that policing was patchwork, that homes were penetrable, that class boundaries could not keep terror confined forever, and that racial injustice, long tolerated, could not prevent dread from eventually spreading beyond those first treated as expendable. In that sense, the case was not only about a killer, it was about what a city learns when violence exposes the truths it has tried not to face. Men who had never spent much thought on the nocturnal vulnerability of servant women suddenly spoke of danger in general terms, as though danger had only just entered the city rather than living foyers in the bodies of the poor. Families who depended upon black women's labor could be alarmed without ever fully recognizing the conditions under which that labor had always been performed. Authorities could promise action while revealing, in their hesitations and failures, how little infrastructure truly existed for justice. Rumor bloomed in the gaps where evidence should have been. Every stranger seemed suspicious. Every footstep after midnight acquired meaning. The city became a listening organism, restless and half-mad with uncertainty, but all of that belonged to the unfolding storm. Part 1. The opening movement of this story belongs to the hour just before full panic, when the atmosphere changes, when the city is still trying to call itself ordinary, and when the women at the center of the coming horror are still moving through their routines, carrying wash, lighting fires, tying aprons, brushing dust from skirts, exchanging tired words at back doors, and walking home beneath a sky so black it seems to erase the road ahead. History often loves the killer's outline because mystery flatters the imagination. It loves the unnerving nickname, the unresolved theory, the long echo of speculation. But the truest opening to this story begins elsewhere. It begins in Austin's divided streets, in the intimate geography of service and survival, in the inherited violence of race, and in the unnoticed courage of women who kept living inside a city that relied on them more than it valued them. Before there was a legend, there were households made clean by hands that cracked in lye water. Before there was public panic, there were women lying down after impossible days, trusting night because human beings must trust something if they are to sleep at all. Before there was myth, there was vulnerability arranged by society and exploited by a predator who found in that arrangement exactly what he needed. So when we step into this case, we do not begin with his face, because history never gave us that. We begin with theirs or as close to theirs as time and neglect will allow. We begin with the city that used them. We begin with the darkness that learned their names too late. Austin in the teen 80s was a city trying to dress itself in the language of progress while still smelling of mud, horse sweat, lamp oil, and the long unfinished business of the South. In daylight, it could seem almost proud of itself. Government buildings suggested importance. Commercial streets hinted at prosperity. Men in waistcoats and broad hats spoke about growth, railroads, new money, and the future, as if the future were already waiting politely at the edge of town. There was a confidence in public speech, the kind cities often invent before they truly earn it. Austin was the capital of Texas, and that title mattered. It gave the place a sense of destiny. It allowed people to imagine refinement where roughness still ruled, but titles do not soften streets. They do not fill empty stomachs, erase racial terror, or turn labor into dignity. Beneath the city's official face, another Austin moved with quieter footsteps, one that did not appear in speeches except when someone needed work done cheaply or blame assigned quickly. That Austin lived in servant quarters, rented shacks, alleys behind fine homes, crowded yards, kitchens hot before dawn, and rooms so narrow that sleep felt borrowed rather than owned. It lived in black neighborhoods shaped not only by poverty but by the afterlife of slavery, because freedom had arrived on paper before it arrived in practice, and for many never arrived in full at all. The war had ended less than 2 decades earlier, but its ending had not brought justice. It had merely changed the forms of dependence. In the old order, bondage had been legal and open. In the new order, exploitation learned to speak in smaller, more respectable terms. Wages, when paid, were meager. Housing was fragile. Safety could disappear in an evening. White households required service as naturally as they required firewood and water, and black women often supplied it, day after day, in exchange for enough money to survive, and not much more. This was the real scaffolding of the city. Men might claim to build Austin with politics and business, but women with tired hands held it together at the level of the body. They washed away its stains, they cooked its meals, they carried its children, they absorbed its irritations, they moved through its homes without ever being fully permitted to belong in them. To understand the terror that would soon take root, one must first understand this arrangement, because it was not accidental background. It was the condition of vulnerability itself. A servant woman's day began before the sky had decided what color it would be. She might step out into chill darkness with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the air cold enough to sting the nose, the ground still holding the dampness of night. Somewhere in the yard, a rooster might break the silence too early. Somewhere else, an infant might already be crying. The first sounds of labor were rarely dramatic. A stove door opening, kindling snapped by hand, water sloshing in a bucket, a broom beginning its patient scrape across a floor. By the time employers woke, much of the day's first battle had already been fought. Fires were lit, breakfast was underway, ash had been carried out, pots had been scrubbed or set ready, and once the household fully rose, work spread in every direction at once. Beds to straighten, clothes to mend, children to feed or watch, laundry to sort and boil, floors to sweep, timber pots to empty, curtains to shake, vegetable peelings to gather, chickens to dress, tables to wipe. The labor was unending because the world it served believed that cleanliness, order, and comfort simply happened, and whenever comfort is treated as natural, someone invisible is paying for it with her body. Many of the women caught within this system had memories that crossed the fault line of emancipation. Some had known slavery firsthand, had felt ownership expressed not only as labor demanded but as time stolen, family threatened, movement controlled. Others were younger, born close enough to the end of slavery to grow up inside its echo. Their mothers might have carried scars from it. Their fathers might have disappeared into debt, peonage, imprisonment, or the wandering instability forced upon black men in a region determined to keep them cheap and disposable. Children learned quickly what kind of attention to avoid, what tone of voice to use, what risks came with being noticed, what other risks came with not being noticed enough. Freedom, in this world, was never simply a door flung wide. It was a road with traps laid all along it. For black women in Austin, domestic service offered one of the few available ways to earn, however poorly. Yet the work placed them in intimate proximity to white households without granting them the protection that intimacy should have implied. They might know the family's routines, illnesses, tempers, secrets, debts, and quarrels. They might rock the baby while the mistress rested, scrub the shirt collars of the man who ignored her existence, and hear through thin walls the disputes of people who would later speak to them as though they were furniture. They were near everything and included in nothing. That nearness created a particular loneliness. It also created patterns a predator could study. Austin's black community was not merely a collection of sufferers waiting for history to wound them. It had its own strength, its own structures of care, and its own forms of entrance. Churches mattered deeply. They were places of worship, yes, but also places of gathering, warning, music, food, and mutual recognition. In a hostile society, recognition was no small thing. To be known by name, to have someone ask after your mother, Your health, your work, your rent, your children, was to be held for a moment against erasure. Neighbors watched for one another as best they could. Women shared advice about employers, exchanged old garments, traded small kindnesses that meant the difference between making it through the week or not. A little lard, a little coffee, a little help with a sick child. Laughter existed too, and it mattered. There is something dishonest in historical storytelling that paints poor communities only in tones of sorrow, as though hardship leaves no room for wit, gossip, flirtation, song, or joy. People still dressed carefully for church when they could. They still fell in love unwisely. They still argued, reconciled, boasted, envied, celebrated. They still made life out of narrow means. The women later remembered under the grim label of servant girls were not all young girls, nor were they a single type. The phrase itself reduces them, making them sound like a category instead of people. Some were adults hardened by labor. Some were wives or daughters. Some worked in homes but maintained their own domestic worlds elsewhere. Some slept near the families they served. Some returned after dark to smaller dwellings at the margins of white neighborhoods. The city's language for them was often condescending even before violence entered the story, and that condescension would shape memory later. The same society that depended on their endurance could diminish their womanhood with a phrase, yet each life contained textures the label could not hold. A favorite dress kept for Sundays, a scar from childhood, a habit of humming while sweeping, a suspicion that an employer was cheating wages, a tenderness toward younger siblings, a fear of men who walked too closely after sunset, a dream of saving enough to leave service for something less humiliating, though what that something might be was often hard to imagine. Austin itself was divided not only by race, but by how it distributed security. White residents with property had doors, locks, reputations, and a greater expectation that the state might respond if they were harmed. The poor, especially the black poor, lived closer to exposure. Their housing was weaker. Their neighborhoods were less patrolled. Their suffering was easier to rationalize away. A murder in one part of town could be framed as shocking evidence of civic danger. In another, it could be absorbed into a colder story about disorder among the lower classes. These distinctions did not remain abstract. They shaped how much fear was publicly permitted and how urgently action was taken. The historical significance of the servant girl annihilator killings lies partly here, in the way race and class shaped not only who was vulnerable but how that vulnerability was narrated. Before the city fully named the terror, it had already decided, in countless small ways, which women stood nearest the edge of concern. Nights in Austin were long in a different way than modern people often imagine. Darkness was not diluted by electric glow. It gathered fully. Trees became masses of ink against the sky. Fences, sheds, and outbuildings cast heavy angles across packed earth. A lantern might illuminate a doorway and leave the rest of the yard swallowed whole. To walk after dark was to trust memory as much as sight. One knew where the ruts were, where a gate dragged on the ground, where the dog was likely to bark, where a loose board might shift underfoot. The city became an arrangement of sounds, a buggy passing farther off than it first seemed, the metallic clank of something set down in a stable, music drifting briefly from a saloon or gathering and vanishing again, whined against branches, the faint call of voices from a porch. Then long stretches of quiet so complete that any interruption could seem like intention. In such a place, the line between ordinary night movement and predatory stalking was terrifyingly thin. One can imagine how women living and working within this landscape measured danger. They had always needed to. A man lingering too long by a fence, a stranger who knew your name when he should not, footsteps that stopped when you stopped. All of this had meaning. For black women in particular, danger was never limited to one kind. There was the threat of white violence, the threat of sexual coercion, the threat of accusation, the threat of assault from men within or outside their communities, the threat of illness without care. the threat of employers who could dismiss them on a whim and leave them hungry by the week's end. What made the coming murders so destabilizing was that they seemed to gather many familiar fears into one brutal figure. Here was a force moving through the city's darkness with purpose, invading sleeping spaces, violating the last fragile boundary between labor and rest. The home, even a poor one, is where the exhausted body believes it can finally loosen. When that belief is shattered, terror does not remain with one victim. It seeps into every household that can imagine the same door, the same bed, the same midnight stillness. Austin in this period was also a city shaped by newspapers eager for circulation and public influence. Print could transform an isolated crime into collective fever. Editors understood appetite. They understood that fear sold papers, especially fear wrapped in lurid detail, moral judgment, and the suggestion of a city under siege. Yet newspapers did not merely report the city's emotions. They organized them. They told readers what to notice, whom to pity, whom to suspect, and whether an event reflected private misfortune or public crisis. A poor black woman murdered might be described in clipped, distancing terms, her individuality flattened. A white victim could prompt more elaborate outrage, as though the same violence had suddenly crossed an invisible line and become intolerable. This imbalance matters because memory itself is built from such decisions. The victims who receive the fewest words are easier for posterity to lose. The city's official institutions were hardly better. Policing in the 1880s did not resemble the forensics-driven investigation later generations might imagine. There were no modern crime labs, no reliable systems of preserving evidence, no scientific profiling. Investigation leaned on observation, rumor, coercion, and the prejudices of the time. Suspicion could attach to a person because of race, accent, occupation, or sheer convenience. Under pressure, authorities often appear busiest where they are least competent, and panic only sharpens that weakness. In a city already stratified by power, the poor could become both the first victims and the first easy suspects. The absence of real investigative tools created a vacuum that rumor rushed to fill. People began inventing explanations almost as quickly as they experienced fear. This was a foreigner. This was a madman. This was revenge. This was a butcher. This was someone the victims knew. This was multiple men. This was someone moving invisibly between social worlds. Each theory revealed as much about Austin's anxieties as about the crimes themselves. Public fear often behaves like this. It seeks a face onto which it can project its own divisions. Sometimes the preferred suspect is the one society already wanted to fear. Sometimes it is the one easiest to condemn without consequence. The city's racial order ensured that black men, migrants, laborers, and the socially marginal would attract suspicion quickly, while the possibility that violence could move through respectable spaces was harder for many to entertain. Yet killers do not always come from where fear expects them. The context of this case is therefore more than geographic or chronological. It is moral context, social context, emotional context. It is the feeling of a city in transition that has mistaken development for justice. It is the fragility of women whose work sustains households that will never fully see them. It is the unfinished wound of slavery carried into streets where freedom remains perilous. It is the way public concern expands when violence begins touching those who were previously imagined safe. It is also the first dawning recognition that Austin's darkness contains a pattern, and that pattern is stalking women who have already been made vulnerable by the shape of the world around them. Perhaps that is why the case still lingers so powerfully in American crime history. It is not simply an early serial killing panic, though it is that. It is also a story about visibility. Who was seen before death? Who was seen after? Who became the face of fear? And who remained buried beneath it? The women at the center of the panic were not all remembered equally because the society around them was not built to remember equally. And yet the violence itself exposed that injustice with terrible clarity. Once fear began to spread beyond the earliest attacks, Austin could no longer maintain the comforting fiction that some people's vulnerability belonged only to them. The city had to confront, however imperfectly, the fact that a threat moving through the night was a threat to the idea of order itself. By then, of course, several women had already paid for that lesson with their blood. In the days before the full panic took hold, life still tried to continue. Laundry still had to be done. Markets still opened. Men still debated politics. Children still ran through yards. Church bells still sounded. Women still rose in the dark to light fires and begin again. That is the haunting part of context in cases like this. History knows what is coming, but the people inside it do not. They move through ordinary hours unaware that ordinary life is about to split open. A woman shakes crumbs from a cloth. Another rubs sore wrists at the end of the day. Another walks home beneath a moon veiled thinly by cloud. Another checks a latch before lying down, believing, because she must, that the night will pass like every other night has passed. Austin, meanwhile, continues speaking proudly about its future, unaware that it is about to become the setting for one of the earliest sustained murder panics in the American imagination. And that the women whose lives will define that panic are women the city had barely learned to honor while they were alive. That is the context in which the story deepens. Not a clean stage prepared for mystery, but a living city built on labor, silence, inequity, and ambition, with danger already moving at the edges of sight. Before the city turned these women into a pattern, before newspapers reduced them to columns of alarm, before rumors swallowed their names in the larger appetite for mystery, they belonged first to themselves. That is where this part must begin. Not with the killer's hand, not with the dark lane, not with the terrible stillness that followed, but with the women whose lives were pressed into history under a label that never fit them. The phrase servant girl is one of those old public expressions that sounds tidy until one sits with it long enough to hear the insult hiding inside. It compresses women into function. It suggests youth even where there was adulthood, obedience where there was endurance, and social smallness where there was in fact an immense burden of labor and survival. Many of the earliest known victims in the Austin killings were black women working in domestic service. And that fact matters not as a footnote but as the center of how the case unfolded and how it was later remembered. Modern summaries of the case identify 8 known victims across 1884 and 1885, including Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Orange Washington, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips, while also noting that several other women survived serious attacks. Those summaries also note that the earliest cluster of fatal attacks fell largely on black women in servant quarters, while only later did public panic intensify further as white women were also killed. Wikipedia 1. What that means in human terms is devastatingly simple. The city learned terror through the suffering of women it had never fully learned to value. If this is to be the victim's statement, then their statement is not a single voice, but a chorus of interrupted lives, each one carrying work, memory, weariness, affection, and private hope into the night. Consider Molly Smith first, because history tends to place her near the beginning of the murders remembered under this name. She was 25 years old, not a child but a grown woman already bearing the marks of labor. She was attacked on the night of December 30th, 1884, and the man Walter Spencer was seriously wounded in the same assault. Wikipedia 1. The historical record can state that much in a clipped line, but a line is not a life. A woman of 25 in Austin in that decade had likely already carried more than many wealthier people carried in twice the years. Work would have shaped her posture, the skin of her hands, the timing of her sleep, the rhythm of her hunger. She may have known exactly how long a fire took to catch in damp weather, exactly how much would a household burn through in a cold spell, exactly how to read the mood of an employer before a word was spoken. She may have lived with the daily contradiction familiar to domestic workers everywhere, necessary at every hour, respected at almost none. She would have moved through rooms she cleaned but did not own, cared for comfort she would never inherit, and returned at day's end to a smaller world where her own exhaustion had to be folded into whatever remained of ordinary life. That is one of the brutal truths of such cases. The victims were not suspended in tragedy waiting to become evidence. They were tired, busy, embodied people. They had errands, aches, preferences, resentments, and plans for tomorrow. Eliza Shelley, murdered on the night of May 6, 1885, belongs in this story with the same fullness. Wikipedia 1. Even when the documents fail to preserve much, absence itself becomes part of the statement. It tells us something about the structure of memory in that city. The women who cleaned, cooked, and kept households running were known intimately inside those households and yet recorded only thinly in the official afterlife of print. Their work entered the record through the smooth functioning of other people's days. Their names entered it far more permanently only when violence forced them there. What must it mean for a society to remember a woman more securely in death than in labor, more vividly in horror than in life? The answer is not mysterious. It means that her humanity was never granted equal weight. It means the city recognized her vulnerability before it recognized her individuality. It means the historical archive was built with the same uneven hands as the social order itself. Irene Cross, murdered on the night of May 22, 1885, is another name that survives because it was attached to an act of violence. Wikipedia 1. Yet even the spare repetition of those names begins to resist erasure. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance. The names have a pulse when spoken together. They begin to sound less like a case file and more like what they were. People once expected by someone at supper, greeted by someone at church, known by someone as daughter, wife, friend, co-worker. Mary Ramey was only 11 years old when she was killed on the night of August 30, 1885, and her mother Rebecca Ramey was seriously wounded in the same attack. Wikipedia 1. The presence of a child inside this sequence breaks something in the imagination every time one encounters it. An 11-year-old belongs to chores, games, fear of scolding, half-finished growth, thin shoulders, quick sleep. Even in a harsh century, even in a poor household where children worked early and learned hardship young, there remains something unbearable about that age. It sharpens the sense that what moved through Austin's nights was not simply violent but desecrating, intent on reaching into spaces where the day's exhaustion had laid bodies down in trust. And Rebecca, the mother who survived serious injury, represents another essential truth of the victim's statement. Some voices continue not because they were protected, but because they endured. The record remembers several women as seriously wounded rather than killed, among them Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, two Swedish servant girls attacked in March 1885, and Clara Dick later that year. Wikipedia 1. Their survival matters not only as evidence of the killer's pattern but as testimony to the afterlife of violence. To survive is not to be spared. It is to continue carrying the night inside the body, to wake again into a city that will speak of the crime with curiosity, dread, speculation, even entertainment, while the survivor bears the plain fact of what fear now feels like in the muscles, in sleep, in the sound of footsteps after dark. If one imagines the women of Austin talking quietly at the backs of houses, at church doors, beside wash lines, then the victim's statement is also in those exchanges. It is in the warnings passed woman to woman long before authorities understand a pattern. Fasten the latch. Do not walk alone if you can help it. Listen if the dog starts up. Wake someone if you hear boards move. The statement is in the altered ritual of night, in lamps left burning longer than before, in men sleeping lightly, not from chivalry alone but because the city has finally begun to feel in its bones what poor women already knew: safety is thin. Gracie Vance and Orange Washington were killed on the night of September 28, 1885. Wikipedia 1 Orange Washington's presence in the victim list complicates the public memory of the case, which often centers women alone because the killer's focus appears overwhelmingly directed toward women. Yet his death also reminds us that intimacy itself became dangerous. To sleep beside someone, to love, to share a room, to let the body drop into unconsciousness near another warm body, all of this belongs to the ordinary architecture of human life. When such spaces are invaded, the crime does not merely take a life, it contaminates a pattern of trust. One can imagine Gracie Vance not as an emblem but as a woman with her own social world, her own way of tying her headscarf, her own circle of people who know her laugh or temper. One can imagine Orange Washington as a man whose name should not survive only as collateral to a larger legend. This case has always threatened to turn people into shadows because the unknown assailant casts such a long one. The ethical work of telling it is to keep dragging the light back the other way. Even the white victims later in the sequence, Susan Hancock and 17-year-old Eula Phillips, whose murders on Christmas Eve 1885 became especially sensational, should not be treated as the moment the story finally became tragic. Their deaths did intensify public panic, and modern summaries note that the last known female victims were white. With the authorities pursuing and even convicting suspects in Eula Phillips's case before that conviction was overturned for insufficient evidence. Wikipedia 1 But the moral center of this history does not begin when white womanhood enters danger. It begins earlier, with the black servant women whose deaths were no less devastating, even if the city's response was less complete. To say that race shaped how the victims were remembered is not a modern imposition on the case. It is visible in the architecture of concern itself, in whose suffering became communal panic and whose was first treated as local sorrow, regrettable, but somehow socially containable. The victim's statement, then, must say this plainly. The city's hierarchy of grief was part of the story from the beginning. It is also important to see these women not only as workers, but as narrators of a hidden Austin. Servant women knew the city from the back entrance. They knew who quarreled behind polite faces, which families were kind, which ones mean, which employers drank too much, which children were sickly, which wives were lonely, which men stared too long. They moved through the private machinery of the city in ways public men never did. Their labor placed them close to the most intimate textures of domestic life, yet their own interiority remained largely unrecorded. That imbalance gives this part of the story its haunting shape. The women likely knew more about Austin than Austin ever cared to know about them. Their statement survives indirectly in the social map their lives imply. It survives in the servant quarters behind respectable houses, in the long walks home after labor, in the fact that many attacks occurred indoors while victims slept, in the repeated vulnerability of women whose work and housing placed them at the edges of protection. Modern summaries describe the victims as attacked indoors while asleep in their beds, often in or near servant quarters, with multiple women dragged outside after the initial assault. Wikipedia 1 Even in stripped-down historical language, the pattern reveals an awful intimacy with the geography of dependence. Someone moved where these women slept. Someone understood how exposed they were. The phrase race shaped how victims were remembered must therefore be expanded into something more human. It means that when later generations hear the nickname Servant Girl Annihilator, they are already hearing the case through the city's old framing. The name foregrounds employment status rather than personhood, and in doing so it preserves a 19th century way of seeing these women primarily as laboring bodies. Even the word annihilator belongs to the public's appetite for monstrosity, not to the women themselves. Their statement resists that language. Their statement says that Molly Smith was not a category, Eliza Shelley was not a Gothic ornament in a murder tale, Irene Cross was not merely one more entry in a chronology. Mary Ramey was a child. Rebecca Ramey was a mother who survived. Gracie Vance and Orange Washington were part of a human bond extinguished by violence. Susan Hancock had a family and a home. Eula Phillips was 17 years old, a fact that lands with a young person's terrible unfinishedness. Wikipedia won to tell the story rightly is to return their dimensions wherever the record allows, and to acknowledge honestly where the record itself has failed them. There is another layer to the victim's statement, and it lies in the response of Austin's black community. Modern accounts note that some black Austinites believed the killer was a white man with near supernatural powers of invisibility, partly because dogs often failed to bark at the seams. Wikipedia 1.1 need not accept the supernatural explanation to understand what it expressed emotionally. It was a way of describing the impossible feeling movement of violence through a racial order that already made white power seem able to appear anywhere and answer for little. When ordinary protection fails repeatedly, communities reach for language big enough to name their dread invisible and catchable. Beyond the rules, those are not merely folkloric ideas. They are emotional truths about what systematic vulnerability feels like from the inside. The women at the center of this case lived at the intersection of race, class, gender, and labor. Their statement is that none of those categories was theoretical. Each one touched the body. Each one shaped who worked where, who slept where, who was protected, who was exposed, who was mourned loudly, who was half forgotten, and who later became a symbol instead of a person. If part one was the city in shadow, and part two the world that built that shadow, then part three must stand still long enough to look at the women themselves and say that the story does not belong first to the hunter. It belongs to those whose ordinary lives were interrupted and then unevenly remembered. Their statement is in the labor they performed before dawn, in the fatigue they carried to bed, in the fear they learned to name to one another, in the silences history left around them, and in the simple, stubborn fact that their names remain. Not all the details of their inner lives can be recovered. That loss is real, but the shape of their humanity can still be honored. They rose early. They worked hard. They lived within structures not of their making. They were loved by somebody. They deserved more safety than the city gave them, more dignity than the newspapers offered them, and more memory than the years first allowed. That is the victim's statement. It is not one sentence. It is an indictment carried by many absent voices at once. It says that a city built on unequal labor cannot pretend surprise when violence follows those lines of inequality. It says that the first women harmed were already standing in the path of danger long before the public called it panic. It says that historical mystery must never be allowed to eclipse historical neglect. And it says, most of all, that before there was a legend about an unknown killer in Austin, there were women lying down at night after honest work, expecting to wake. Night did not fall on Austin all at once. It gathered by degrees, draining the last brass color from the western sky, pulling the detail out of fences and porches, softening wagon ruts into dark seams in the earth until the city seemed less built than sketched in charcoal. Somewhere a dog barked once, and then stopped. Somewhere a screen door slapped shut. Somewhere a woman finished the last hard motion of the day, setting aside a wash basin, banking a kitchen fire, straightening a rough blanket over a child already asleep. That was how the hour of danger began in this story, not with spectacle, but with ordinary exhaustion. By the time the attacks came, the women at the center of them were often already deep inside the vulnerable ritual of sleep, laid down after long labor in rooms that offered privacy only in the thinnest sense. Historical summaries of the case note that the known victims were attacked indoors while asleep in their beds, and that several women were then dragged outside, unconscious but still alive, where the violence continued. Wikipedia 1. The plainness of that fact is what makes it so disturbing. These were not confrontations in open streets. They were violations of the final small sanctuary available to the poor. To picture the incident as it unfolded across those months in 1884 and 1885, one must picture first the bodies of working women finally surrendering to rest. The rooms close with stale heat or winter chill, the walls thin, the beds narrow, the air full of the faint domestic smells of soap, iron, wood smoke, old cloth, damp earth brought in on shoes. In such rooms the day ended not in peace exactly, but in necessity. A woman had to sleep because the next dawn would demand her again. The killer moved into that necessity. He entered where fatigue had lowered resistance, where doors and latches were only as strong as the money available to build them, where servant quarters and small dwellings stood half apart from the households they sustained, close enough for use and far enough for neglect. It is one thing for a city to fear a threat in alleys and roads. It is another to understand that the threat is stepping over thresholds and bending over beds. The incident, as a recurring pattern rather than a single isolated crime, announced itself through intimacy. Every attack said the same terrible thing. There was nowhere poor women could assume themselves unwatched. Consider the likely atmosphere of those nights. Austin's darkness in the 1880s was dense and practical, not the softened darkness of a modern city. Lamps gave islands of light, not security. A yard could hide a man 3 strides from a doorway. A shed, a privy, a fence line, a stack of wood, a tree branch moving in the wind, all could distort the eye. If a figure crossed a patch of ground between one building and another, he might be visible only for a second before disappearing back into blackness. This physical environment mattered because the attacks depended not only on brutality but on approach. The assailant, whoever he was, came close enough to sleeping victims to begin the assault before the household fully understood what was happening. In some cases there were surviving witnesses or wounded companions, but descriptions were contradictory and modern accounts emphasize how confused, fragmentary, and inconsistent eyewitness testimony proved to be. Wikipedia 1 that, too, belongs to the incident. Violence of this kind happens fast at first, in the stunned moment between sleep and comprehension. The mind wakes before the body can act. Sound becomes strange. A crash is not yet a crash but a rupture in dream. A hand thrown up and instinct meets force already descending. By the time a neighbor hears something, the first decisive blows may already have fallen. The case's chronology gives us names and dates, but part form must enter the emotional mechanics of what those nights meant. On December 30th, 1884, Molly Smith was murdered and Walter Spencer was badly wounded in the same attack. On May 6, 1885, Eliza Shelley was killed. On May 22, Irene Cross was murdered. On August 30th, the 11-year-old Mary Ramey was killed, and her mother Rebecca was seriously injured. On September 28th, Gracie Vance and Orange Washington were killed. On December 24, 1885, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were murdered, the last two known victims in the sequence. Modern summaries also note several non-fatal attacks on Clara Strand, Christine Martinson, and Clara Dick. Wikipedia 1 read as a list. The dates have an archival flatness. Lived as nights, they would have felt like a city being visited again and again by the same impossible trespass. One household disturbed, then another months later, then another before fear could settle, then another until no earlier explanation still held. At first people may have reached for the ordinary lies communities tell themselves, a domestic quarrel, a grudge, a drunk, a single aberration, but incidents accumulate their own logic. The repetition turns explanation into panic, yet repetition also conceals something even crueler. Each attack was singular to the person inside it. For the victim, the incident was not part of a pattern. It was the whole world narrowing in an instant to terror, confusion, pain, and the desperate human instinct to survive. Imagine one of those rooms just before the violence. Perhaps the woman has gone to sleep in the same work dress she will wear again at dawn, or with it folded carefully over a chair because she owns too few garments to treat any lightly. Perhaps a child is breathing nearby. Perhaps a man lies beside her, or perhaps she sleeps alone in a small outbuilding behind a white family's home. Perhaps she has checked the door once already. Perhaps she did not bother because the day was too long and the body too tired. Then something shifts. A pressure at the entrance, a sudden shadow, the sound of wood or metal, the unnatural presence of another body where none should be. There is no time in such moments for theatrical fear. There is only reaction, a cry perhaps, or a choked half-cry, a hand thrown upward, a twist of blankets. The bed becoming, in one instant, the worst place in the world because it tangles the legs and slows escape. Historical descriptions of the case often emphasize the use of axes and knives and the recurring mutilation of victims outdoors after they were dragged from bed. Wikipedia 1. Even without dwelling on every physical detail, the pattern is enough to convey the killer's method: overwhelm, disable, remove, continue. That structure of violence tells us something chilling about intention. These were not hurried robberies gone wrong. They were attacks with momentum, with a dreadful follow-through. The dragging of bodies outside turned private terror into a kind of public desecration, as if the killer needed the open ground, the yard, the dirt, the distance from the bed, to complete whatever dark ritual or compulsion governed him. The yard itself becomes a second scene in the incident, almost as important as the bedroom. One can imagine the scrape across floorboards or packed earth, the catching of cloth, the faint trail left in dust or mud, the night air striking skin that a moment before had still been warm under blankets. Outside, the city remained mostly asleep. The stars would have gone on shining over fences, roofs, and tree limbs. Somewhere nearby an employer might have slept through the whole thing in the main house. That possibility is one of the most haunting elements of the case. The social distance between servant quarters and the homes they served could be measured in yards and still amount to abandonment. A woman could labor all day for a household and die at night just beyond its comfort, close enough that her work shaped the family's life, and far enough that her own screams might not reach their ears in time. This is what makes the incident more than a sequence of murders. It is a tableau of social arrangement made suddenly visible through blood. Even when the attacks touched white victims later in 1885, the underlying mechanics of intrusion remained the same. Sleep was the doorway. Isolation was the opportunity. The city's patchwork of class and race determined who was most exposed first. As the months passed, each new incident changed the meaning of night for everyone else. The moment of attack no longer belonged only to the person being assaulted. It began to inhabit the imagination of the whole city. Women go into bed had to picture not just latches and shutters, but a man moving silently in darkness, a shape that might already be in the yard. Men began listening for sounds they had once ignored. Newspapers amplified each incident until the city was living in anticipation of the next one, not because anyone knew where it would happen, but because the killer's method had taught them a new relationship to fear. Danger did not announce itself from a distance, it appeared at arm's length. Contemporary and later accounts describe wildly conflicting witness descriptions of the assailant, including reports that he was white, dark-complexioned, disguised, masked, or even working with an accomplice. Wikipedia 1. That swirl of contradictory images belongs to the incident too, because it shows how trauma fractures perception. A person awakened by violence does not become a reliable camera. A neighbor glimpsing motion in half-light sees color, cloth, posture, perhaps a hat, perhaps a rag over the face, then only absence. The result was not clarity but multiplication. The killer became many men at once in public imagination, each version carrying one of the city's anxieties: a black man, a foreigner, a madman, a butcher, a gang, a respectable man in disguise. The inability to hold the attacker in one stable image made every incident feel larger, more spectral. It was as though the violence itself had learned to move faster than identity. But the incident was not spectral to the victims. It was physical in the most terrible way. Beds overturned, bodies wounded, loved ones waking into horror, neighbors rushing late with lamps, somebody kneeling in dirt trying to understand whether breath still remained, somebody else running for police who did not yet know what they were running toward. The first minutes after an attack must have had their own frantic texture, incoherent accounts, blood on hands, questions asked too quickly, panic colliding with practical need. Lift her, bring light, fetch a doctor, find the patrolman. Who saw him? Which way did he go? Was there one man or two? Is she alive? Where is the child? Where is the husband? That aftermath is part of the incident because it reveals how thinly prepared the city was. There was no system capable of absorbing violence like this without also producing chaos. Each crime scene would have carried traces, but traces in the 19th century were fragile things, vulnerable to trampling, weather, assumption, and the haste of frightened people. The killer did not merely attack bodies. He attacked the city's capacity to know, and in doing so he forced Austin into a posture of helpless attention. The Christmas Eve murders of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips gave the panic its most explosive social turn. Because by then 2 white women were dead in a way the whole city could no longer contain as violence only against the poor and black. Sources note that the killing spree's final known victims were these 2 white women, and that this greatly intensified alarm. Wikipedia 1. Yet it is important, especially here in the incident section, not to let that escalation rewrite the earlier nights. The incident had been atrocious from the beginning. The beds were no less invaded when the women were black. The yards were no less terrible. The blood was no less real. What changed was not the fundamental horror of the act but the breadth of the city's identification with it. Once that happened, every previous attack seemed to rearrange itself in public memory, as though Austin were only then beginning to understand what had already been happening to its most vulnerable women. That delayed recognition is one of the deepest moral injuries in the story. So Part 4, the incident, must finally rest on the simplest and hardest image, a sleeping city, and within it a repeating rupture. A woman lies down after labor. Darkness settles around the room. The city breathes slowly, then the boundary fails, wood gives way or a door opens or a figure appears where only shadow had been. The victim wakes into confusion, then certainty too late. Violence arrives not as an argument, not as a warning, but as contact, a blow, a struggle, a body dragged, dirt disturbed, silence returning by degrees after the killer is gone. Then voices, lamps, running feet, grief beginning before dawn has even broken. This happened again and again in Austin between late 1884 and late 1885. The pattern is historically documented, the dates and victims recorded, the methods grimly consistent even amid variations. Wikipedia 1. But beyond chronology, the incident was the destruction of the most fundamental human trust. The poor could still claim that after a day of labor, one might at least close one's eyes in relative safety. In this story, that trust was shattered first in servant quarters and humble rooms, then across the whole imagination of the city, and once shattered, it could never be fully repaired. By the time dawn touched a crime scene in Austin during those months of terror, the first violence had already done its work twice. It had wounded the body in darkness, and then it had transformed an ordinary sleeping place into a spectacle of dread. The room itself became evidence before anyone in the city yet knew how to read evidence properly. A bed that should have held the shape of rest instead held the shape of interruption. Blankets were twisted back, a pallet shoved crooked, a chair knocked aside, a door standing open or broken against its frame, a washstand catching the first gray light. And everywhere the awful sense that the night had entered, as if the walls and locks of the poor were made only of paper. This is where Part 5 must remain, in the hour after the attack, when the crime scene is still wet with confusion, and the earliest clues have not yet hardened into theory. Modern summaries and archival overviews agree on several recurring features of the Austin murders. Victims were often attacked while asleep indoors. Several were dragged outside after the initial assault. A bloody axe or other implement was often left behind. Footprints were sometimes found, and bloodhounds were brought in on at least some occasions in the desperate hope that instinct might succeed where the city's investigators could not. Travis County Archives won those details, spare as they are, tell us what the first witnesses would have confronted. They tell us that the scene did not begin with neat police procedure. It began with shock. Someone had to carry a lamp close enough to understand what he was seeing. Someone had to kneel. Someone had to call a name that no longer answered. Someone had to look from the room to the yard and realize that the horror had not ended where the bed stood. The yards themselves mattered because they turned domestic space inside out. A servant quarter or small dwelling was never fully private to begin with. It stood in relation to fences, sheds, back doors, alleys, trees, and the larger house that drew labor from the victim during the day and so often failed to shelter her at night. When a woman was dragged out into that exposed patch of ground, the crime scene stretched with her. Dirt became witness. Grass became witness. A fence rail, a gate, a bit of torn cloth, a disturbed track, all of it might speak if anyone knew how to listen. But 19th century investigation was a clumsy listener. People crowded too close. Feet trampled over what should have been preserved. Neighbors rushed in with urgency that was humane and destructive at once. Doctors, family members, employers, patrolmen, and gawkers each altered the scene simply by trying to understand it. The first clues in a case like this are always fragile. But in Austin they were fragile in a particularly cruel way because the people collecting them did not possess the forensic tools later generations would take for granted. A footprint in damp earth might seem invaluable one moment, and then lose all meaning when a half-dozen other boots crossed nearby. A dropped weapon might look decisive, but without modern methods it was also only an object, frightening and mute, more useful for newspapers than for certainty. Even the arrangement of wounds, which later readers treat as pattern, would at the time have been filtered through inquests, hurried observation, rumor, and the uneven skill of local officials. The crime scene was therefore not a silent field waiting to be decoded. It was a place where truth and noise began contaminating each other almost immediately. Yet some things were plain even to frightened eyes. The killer was entering sleeping spaces. He was using brutal force at close range. He was often carrying or seizing tools sharp enough to turn the body into a message. And he was moving through Austin with enough confidence, or enough luck, to leave before the city could close its hand around him. That confidence can be felt in the scenes themselves. There is a particular arrogance in a killer who lingers long enough to drag a body outdoors, long enough to leave a weapon behind, long enough to trust darkness and confusion more than he fears pursuit. He is not simply striking and fleeing from a roadway. He is stepping into intimate terrain and remaking it around his violence. One can almost sense the first officers arriving at such places and recognizing, however dimly, that they were looking at something larger than a single quarrel or robbery. The bedroom did not resemble a simple intrusion for theft. The yard did not resemble an accident. The position of the body, the transition from interior to exterior, the repetition across cases, all pointed toward intention of a terrifyingly focused kind. According to modern summaries, the crime scenes were consistent enough that people at the time noticed recurring features, even though officials and newspapers still struggled to decide whether one man, several men, or even a gang was responsible. Travis County Archives won that uncertainty is one of the strangest elements of the early clues. Today a repeating pattern encourages the mind to imagine a single offender. In Austin then, repetition generated both pattern and chaos. Because the attacks were so brutal, because witnesses were inconsistent, because race and class distorted perception, Every clue seemed capable of supporting several contradictory stories at once. A footprint might suggest one man to one investigator and another to the next. A witness glimpsing a figure in partial light might supply race, clothing, height, or disguise in combinations that reflected not only memory but fear. The early clues therefore did not calm the city by narrowing possibilities. They inflamed the panic by multiplying them. There was also the terrible problem of proximity. Many of the earliest attacks involved black servant women in or near the quarters where they slept, often behind the homes of white employers. That meant the crime scene did not exist in some remote wilderness. It existed within the functioning geography of the city itself, within yards crossed daily by people carrying water, ash, laundry, and meals. The killer had not chosen an alien landscape. He had chosen the backside of ordinary life. That fact should have been one of the earliest and most important clues, not about his identity exactly, but about his confidence and familiarity. He seemed to understand where women slept, how separate those spaces were from immediate protection, and how darkness pulled around the domestic architecture of service. This does not prove that he worked in service himself or belonged to any one household, but it does suggest that the scenes were shaped by the city's unequal design as much as by the killer's impulse. In other words, the crime scene was never just the room or the yard. The crime scene was Austin's social map. It included the distance between the main house and the servant's bed. It included the weakness of the latch. It included the fact that a woman might be indispensable all day and almost unguarded all night. Even the clues the city hoped would rescue it often turned into symbols of helplessness. Footprints promised something direct and bodily, the fantasy that a mark in earth could lead one human being to another with the inevitability of a drawn line. Bloodhounds promised a more dramatic version of the same hope, a natural certainty stronger than human confusion. Archival accounts note that footprints were sometimes found and bloodhounds used, but neither produced a resolution. Travis County Archives won there is something heartbreaking about that image. Men standing in a yard after sunrise, staring at impressions in dirt, calling for dogs, trying to make the ground itself confess. It tells us how badly the city wanted the scenes to yield a direction, any direction, and how quickly that hope ran into the reality of contamination, weather, distance, and the sheer disorder of a populated town. Austin was not an untouched field in which one set of tracks crossed empty land. It was a place of wagons, horses, workers, passers-by, and anxious citizens. A clue that might have mattered for an hour could become worthless by noon, and while the city fumbled with such signs, the newspapers were already turning them into public drama. Every crime scene generated description. Every description generated speculation. Every speculation returned to the scene and altered what people believed they had seen there. This feedback loop between scene and story is central to the case. The earliest clues were not handled in a quiet laboratory. They were handled in a feverish civic atmosphere where official incompetence, racial prejudice, and commercial journalism all competed to define meaning. If a bloody axe was found, it was both a possible clue and an instant headline. If tracks appeared, they were not merely tracks but invitations to public fantasy. If the dogs failed, then even failure became evidence of something uncanny. Modern accounts record that some black Austinites came to believe the killer had near supernatural powers of invisibility, partly because dogs were not heard barking around some scenes. Wikipedia to that belief, whether literal or not, was itself a clue of another kind. It revealed the emotional truth of the crime scenes as experienced by the community most exposed to them. The killer seemed able to pass through yards, fences, and sleeping spaces without the normal alarms of the night world. No dog, no neighbor, no board creak, no quick intervention seemed enough. To call him invisible was to describe not magic so much as the collapse of expected warning. The scene after each attack therefore held not just physical traces, but a spiritual disturbance. Familiar places no longer behaved as they should. The yard did not protect. The dog did not bark. The house did not hold. The city's ordinary logic was failing. One of the most revealing archival pieces connected to the murders is the surviving autopsy and inquest material for Susan Hancock, preserved through the Travis County Archives. Those records exist because her murder on Christmas Eve 1885 became part of the city's most explosive moment of panic and official response. Travis County Archives, one their survival reminds us that the crime scene eventually becomes paperwork, ink, signatures, testimony, a bureaucratic afterlife that can look cold beside the actual human shock of the morning itself. But paperwork is only the city's attempt to control the scene after the fact. The true first scene is always emotional before it is legal, a husband or child seeing the body, a neighbor turning away and then looking back because not looking would feel like abandonment, a patrolman trying to appear composed, an employer realizing with a sting of horror that the woman who made breakfast yesterday now lies ruined in the yard behind the same property. The earliest clues live inside those reactions as much as in objects. They shape which details get remembered, which are exaggerated, which are missed entirely. If the witness is terrified, he recalls the impossible. If he is prejudiced, he notices what confirms prejudice. If he is ashamed, he speaks too little. Thus the crime scene begins dividing into layers almost immediately: what happened, what was seen, what was reported, what was misremembered, what was turned into gossip, what was entered in official records, and what was lost. Part 5 must sit inside that division. It must show not only the scene, but the birth of uncertainty at the scene, and uncertainty came fast. Modern summaries note contradictory eyewitnesses.